I'm going to give you a survey of some few Jewish ideas about the soul. In Judaism, unlike to some extent in Islam or Christianity, there's no tradition of dogmatic pronouncement. Some people tried, but Jews have never accepted that there is simply one view. So there are many, many different views. So that's not a simple soul, because views of the soul have changed tremendously. It's also not a simple soul because each view of the soul, or many of them, propose something that is actually quite complex, despite the fact that many thinkers say, as we've already heard, the soul is one and simple, but it never is really one and simple. Other speakers have already introduced us to the creation stories in Genesis. The first one, in Genesis chapter 1, speaks about God creating the human through God's word, but Tselem Elohim, in the image of God, as an image of God. And that will become one of the central thoughts that runs through as we discuss what is the human being and what is the soul. And Genesis chapter 2, as we've also heard, has God breathing into Adam, into the human, the breath of life. And we have there two words, nishmat, chayim, nishmat, neshama is the breath, and the Adam became a nefesh chaya, became a living soul, a living nafs, a living being. And so these words also, together with the word ruach, which we'll come to, have a long and complex history throughout Jewish and Islamic and other thought. So these terms all come to be translated as soul or as spirit, and usually understood as some kind of immaterial or ethereal entity that inhabits and enlivens the body, but is in principle, in some way, separable from it. And we've discussed many different options and possibilities of that today. But in early biblical writing, which many now look back to and try and understand in its own terms, there is no evidence of body-soul or body-mind dualism. And contemporary Jewish approaches to the Hebrew Bible generally emphasize the holistic, non-dualistic understanding of these terms. The nefesh, the nafs, is simply the self, or the life force, our animated self, inherent in the body, and especially in the blood. There's a verse that says, Hadam hu nefesh, the blood is the nafs, is the life. The neshama is breath, literally breath, that makes us alive. And the ruach, too, is breath, or perhaps the motive force, like the wind that blows something. The ruach is what moves us and gives us energy. But when we come to later stages of the Hebrew scriptures, the picture becomes more complex. The author of Ecclesiastes, or Kohelet, probably around the 3rd century before the Common Era, possibly troubled by Platonic stirrings in a Hellenistic world, first asserts that humans and beasts are equally mortal. All go to one place, all are from the dust, and all turn to dust again. But then, rather plaintively, he asks, who knows whether the spirit, the ruh of man, goes upward and the spirit of the beast goes downward to the earth? Who knows? A very modern question. But later, reflecting on death, towards the end of the book, he says, the dust returns to the earth as it was, and the ruach returns to God who gave it. He probably meant that the animating breath disperses up into the air, but later tradition changes the and to a but. The body crumbles, but the human spirit is immortal. And in that sense, it's given comfort to mourners at funerals for centuries, even though Kohelet might not have meant it that way. Another much loved passage is from the Psalms, the Zabur, where the psalmist says, "For you will not abandon my nefesh, my nafs, to Sheol, to the grave or the underworld. You will not allow your faithful one to see corruption. You will show me the path of life. In your presence is fullness of joy. At your right hand, pleasures forevermore." Psalm 16. Does this mean, as countless generations have believed, that the immortal soul is saved from perdition and enjoys eternal bliss in God's presence? Or was it originally an expression of the psalmist's confidence that God would lengthen the lives of the righteous, save them from all earthly dangers, and reward them with lasting worldly prosperity? There's a good chance that's what the psalmist originally meant. In intertestamental writings like the Wisdom of Solomon, which Chris quoted to us, and certainly in the New Testament, we see that body-mind dualism had developed, was in the process of developing, probably under Hellenistic influence. And this became a topic of great interest in the rabbinic discourse, where ideas about post-mortem spiritual survival coexist in a complex and unresolved way with the belief in bodily resurrection at the end of days. The rabbis embraced both of these ideas, and they weren't systematic thinkers, so they never really bothered to work out exactly what happens when. You just kind of accept it all. But generally, early rabbinic writings lay stress on the importance of the body-soul nexus in divine reward and punishment. It would be unjust to judge one without the other. But later Jewish spirituality moved in a much more dualist direction and imagined reward in a more purely spiritual sphere. In contrast to Christian orthodoxy, which insisted that on the creation of the soul simultaneously with the body at conception, and the church father Origen was condemned for believing otherwise, a rabbinic consensus developed that all souls were created at the beginning of time. Usually it's during the 6 days of creation, and exist in inchoate form with God until their time comes to be incarnated. And we've heard about that a great deal. Souls were said to have been hewn from God's throne of glory, from that mystical world of the divine throne, and then stored up in a guf, in some kind of a spiritual body, a heavenly waiting room, until it's their time to be born. But there are other passages, and this is an interesting connection we don't have time to explore fully, that suggest that the souls of the righteous existed even before creation, because there's a passage that says God consulted with the righteous, with the souls of the righteous, before creating the world. I don't have time to unpack what that might mean. The rabbis saw the soul as filling, animating, and ruling the body, as God's presence fills, animates, and rules the world. The soul, as the image of God, is God within us, and Deus in homo is a well-known Stoic and Christian idea too. An important passage, no, I think I'll skip that bit. Rabbi Jeff, already quoted to us in one of the answers he gave this morning, the daily morning prayer that comes from the Talmud and is recited every morning. My God, the soul you have given me is pure. You created and formed it and breathed it into me. So that original breathing into Adam becomes the breathing into each and every one of us. You guard it within me. One day you will take it from me and return it to me in the hereafter, in the world to come. Blessed are you, O Lord, who restores souls to the dead. But it's important to add to this idea of the purity of the soul that the rabbis also saw a duality and indeed a conflict within the soul. They say we are born with we are created with two inclinations, a good inclination that draws us to do God's will, and an evil inclination that draws us away and tempts us otherwise. And even that When we're born, it's the evil inclination that rules us. It's our need to survive and to take and to feed and to scream until somebody feeds us. That's the evil inclination. When it says in Genesis, and God saw all that he had made and it was very good, one rabbinic interpretation says good means the good inclination, but very good means the evil inclination, because that's what drives us to live in this world, to do what we need to survive, but it's inherently selfish and self-seeking. Now I want to turn to the theories in Greek philosophy, which have already been referred to by Chris and others, about the different parts or faculties of the soul. And for some, it becomes a hierarchy of different souls. So Plato speaks of a vegetative faculty or soul, an animal soul, and an intellectual soul. And this made its way into Jewish philosophy in the Middle Ages in the work of Saadia Gaon, who was a Mutazilite style Jewish philosopher in Baghdad in the 10th century. He identifies the nefesh, the nafs, with, and he wrote in Arabic, so he probably did say nafs, the nefesh with the appetitive faculty, wanting and needing, ruach with the power to become bold and angry, sort of the emotional motivation, and the neshama with the soul's power of cognition. But nevertheless, these still make up one undivided soul. The idea is developed further in a very influential biblical commentary in the 12th century of Abraham ibn Ezra in Andalusia, who links the three parts of the soul to bodily organs. And I'm going to quote a little passage from him. Man's body comes from the lowest world. However, man's soul, neshama, which is the breath, which is tied to the body, comes from on high. There are two powers that are intermediate between the body and the soul. These two powers are referred to in Hebrew as the ruach and the nafs. For the soul is the rational, for the neshama is the rational part of man, and its place is in the brain. From it comes the power of all emotions and the desire to move. Interesting. So the intellectual in the brain is also the power of the emotions and the desire to move. The ruach is situated in the heart. Life depends on the ruach. The ruach desires to dominate. That is, it seeks to overcome all opposition. It is the source of anger. The seat of the nefesh, the nafs, is in the liver. It is the nefesh that desires to eat, and the nefesh is the source of sexual desire. So he creates this sort of bodily as well as spiritual hierarchy. I'm turning now to the Aristotelian side of things, which gradually took over in philosophy from the Platonic side. Moses Maimonides, in the 12th century, focuses a belief in immortality not so much on the soul, but on the mind. The soul is one, but has five faculties: the nutritive, the sensitive, the imaginative, the appetitive, and the rational. This is following Aristotle, more or less. But the soul, as Sheikh Arif has said, is the form of the body. It doesn't exist without the body. It is the way the matter that is our body functions as a human body, and therefore it perishes when the time of the body's life comes to an end. The matter and form separate. So it perishes. All that can survive is the acquired intellect. That is, the true ideas of eternal things that a person, and the person would normally be a philosopher, has assimilated into their intellect, and which, as the forms of eternal things, of God or the separate intellects, are likewise eternal. This, for Maimonides, this is not a personal immortality, since it involved the merging of the individual acquired intellect into the universal active intellect. Is that right? No, it doesn't matter. Okay, so some of you will recognize there the thinking of Al-Farabi and Ibn Bajjah, in contrast with the more Platonic doctrine of Ibn Sina, that the soul as an ethereal spiritual entity enjoys some sense of personal immortality. Maimonides was not prepared to entertain that, as far as we can tell. The impersonal and elitist implications of this concept, that immortality is only for the fully developed intellect, the philosophically enlightened, of course proved unacceptable to most Jewish thinkers, both in Maimonides' time and later. By contrast, under Neoplatonic influence, the Jewish mystics of the Kabbalah in Provence and Catalonia and Andalusia in the 12th, 13th century drew upon that variety of biblical terminology to create a complex, multi-layered theory of the soul, which I'll now describe briefly. It began as a three-tiered model: Nefesh, Ruach, Neshama, usually understood with the Nefesh, the lowest level, the animation of the body, the Ruach as the emotional or perhaps even ethical level of the soul, and the Neshama as the highest intellectual level. Yeah, thank you. In Kabbalistic thinking, only the lowest level was actually invested in our body, and only those who merited it would have granted to them the higher levels of the soul in this sort of multi-tiered model. The Kabbalists speculated about the diverse origins of these various levels of the soul. The neshama, the intellectual soul, comes from the exalted head, as the Kabbalists mystically and metaphorically thought of it, the head of the divine, the attributes of wisdom and understanding. The intermediate ruach came from the divine torso, with its contrasting qualities of love and awe, of mercy and strict justice. And the animating nefesh from the level of divine sovereignty, which is the immanent aspect of God sustaining the world as the nefesh sustains and fills the body. In very bold and anthropomorphic mystical imagery, human souls were said to be born of the supernal union of the masculine and feminine divine hypostasis. So this mystical concept of masculine and feminine aspects of God which join together and engender human souls. Very bold idea. This is an audacious literalization and the idea of humans as children of God. Our souls are quite, well, not literally, but mystically, the offspring of God's loving self-fertilization. This comes to the fore, particularly in the Zohar in the 13th century, late 13th century. With this comes an idea probably derived ultimately from Al-Ghazali of the soul as God's image within us, so that the way to know God was to look deep within, where our soul as a mirror reflects God back to us. Sometimes the soul is described as threads of light, so not so much within us, but a thread of light connecting the human below with the divine source above. By fulfilling the 613 commandments, these threads were multiplied into a mighty rope connecting us with God. But every commandment broken severs a strand until the person is cut off from God. There is also the doctrine of transmigration, that God will send souls back to another body in another life if they haven't completed their spiritual mission in one lifetime. Each soul, according to this Kabbalistic concept, has a particular tikkun or repair that it needs to achieve in the world. And it might take one lifetime or it might take many. I'm shortening my remarks quite a bit here. This was also linked to the idea, already alluded to, of a universal soul, like that of Adam, which included all human souls ever to be born, so that individual souls in this world belong to different limbs or branches of this great cosmic soul, and therefore are linked in groups with others from the same mystical limb, which they had the duty to repair and redeem. And that's why some souls can lead others in a sort of spiritual guidance in this world, because they come from the same root in the cosmic soul of Adam. And I want to add here, I haven't written it down, that another universal soul is the soul of the Messiah, still to come in Jewish thought. And so each person who repairs and redeems their own spark of the divine, which I'll come to in a minute, that spark then coalesces with all the others to become the soul of the Messiah. We build the soul of the Messiah as we fulfill our divine purpose on earth. That's generally a later Hasidic idea. I want to refer briefly now, before I finish, to the exclusivity or particularism that comes into these mystical ideas. This goes back probably to the 12th century Andalusian poet and thinker Judah Halevi, and derives probably from Shi'i influenced ideas about an Amr Ilahi, a divine quality, which in his theology is inherited through the line of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. A divine quality. So I think in Shi'i Islam, this is something to do with the Imam. And Judah Halevi extends it to all those who are descended from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who inherit this Amr Ilahi, this divine quality. And in the Kabbalah, this becomes the idea of a godly soul, a spark of the divine, which is boldly referred to as an actual portion of God from above, which passes down this particular line in order to bring us closer to God and ultimately to contribute to redemption. On a personal note, I struggled hard in my youth with these particularistic ideas, which may have sprung in part from the experience of being a persecuted and powerless religious minority, trying to stand up for ourselves in former ages. But these ideas were in sharp conflict with my own upbringing, my own experience of dialogue with friends of other religions, and with the more rationalistic and universalist teaching at the synagogue, the Orthodox synagogue where I grew up. These extreme interpretations nearly drove me out of Judaism and into the arms of the church, but I got over that. While such beliefs, and this is my last paragraph, I promise you, while such beliefs are still active amongst some of the strictly Orthodox, they are very, very far from the Maimonidean universalism dominant in modern Orthodox Judaism, let alone the prevalent agnosticism amongst many Jews today about the very existence of an immortal soul. It is extraordinary how prevalent the conviction is among many Jews that Jews, that Judaism does not believe in an immortal soul or in reward and punishment after death. And they characterize that, and I hear this regularly, as the otherworldly preoccupation of Christianity. So this is a post-Enlightenment, distinctly modern Jewish way of trying to differentiate ourselves from the majority, the Christian majority. Perhaps in a sense, this is a return full circle to the non-dualist biblical conception of the human being. But that doesn't mean that we should not also cherish those other more complex ideas of the soul, not necessarily take them literally, but appreciate the powerful symbolism and the way they offer to us to find ways in the complexity of our lives and our experience to come closer to God. Thank you.